So let's jump right in. Let's explore the issue of censorship on campus. So I'm going to start the discussion by directing a question towards you, Emma. Emma, your recent article published by the New York Times titled, "I Came to College Eager to Debate, I Found Self-Censorship Instead." It caused quite a stir, and in it you describe a culture of self-repression on campus. You talk of hushed voices and anxious looks, and you lament your university experience as one of monotonous echo chambers. Could you describe in more detail what you expected going into college and what you found instead?
Yeah, so what I was really hoping for was a kind of environment where discussions were kind of able to go where they needed to go to find the truth, right? Where there's an appreciation for ideological diversity. And of course, there's debate and discussion and conflict, but it's welcomed and not the kind of conflict that can be, I guess the best way to describe it is maybe reputation marring. But instead, what I found was this environment where I think it really comes down to this idea that your political beliefs denote moral worth, right? And that if you do not have this very specific set of political beliefs, that means you are a bad person, you're an immoral person. And because of the weight of that, I think a lot of people are so scared to be caught thinking the wrong thing at the wrong place at the wrong time. Right, that they don't be caught saying the wrong thing, so they don't allow themselves to maybe think the wrong thing, and so discussions basically get nowhere. And even discussions or admissions of opinions, even slightly off the mean, there's this tremendous anxiety that I would see my peers express. So when I say hushed voices, it would literally be I would be discussing with friends, and then say a specific controversial topic would come up, and I would see them looking behind their backs. I would see them going to shut the door so that way they're not overheard saying something wrong, right? Because it's so easy to have one's reputation tarnished. And so that's really this kind of prevailing environment that surprised me, but I found very consistent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's very worrying. Sounds very worrying. Sam, I know you had a similar experience at the University of Edinburgh. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, it was back in the, let's call it the BLM summer of summer 2020, when I had previously in the lead up to that summer, well, in the spring, in March, I'd written a very innocent article, perhaps naive, arguing for the virtues of kind of having a colorblind attitude towards tackling racism. And this was for a free speech supporting student publication. Their code of ethics, etc., actively stated their commitment to free speech. And anyway, fast forward to the summer, and all of a sudden my article was deemed to deny oppression. And I was accused of being X, Y, and Z, all of the isms out there, and dragged through the mud. The article was censored, it was taken down. And then, I got in touch with the Free Speech Union. But that was kind of the moment where things blew up for me, where I realized that actually how much people self-censor and how much of a problem it really is and how deep it runs. It's Emma was just saying how people are scared, and I think it's easy to mess up the situation. Look, we're not in authoritarian China or in Hungary. It's not that bad, but I do believe that the fear is real. I look at some of my friends, people that I would qualify as friends, who are sharing articles suggesting that for instance, the words of Kathleen Stock, of gender critical academic Kathleen Stock, like actively harm trans people. Now we can have a debate about that, and of course I would defend their right to argue that. But the fact is, when this thinking is so routine and so tangible amongst student communities, I wouldn't want to have that conversation with that friend, because I know how passionate they feel about it, and how sadly the tendency these days is to fall out about things rather than to, realize your common ground, accept your differences, and, just go for a pint.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a sad reality, and I do wonder if any of you have lost friends because of that, because you feel like you can't have open conversations with each other.
So, I mean, I wouldn't say that I've lost friends, partly because I don't have those conversations. You see those, routinely in the UK, studies suggest that over half of students are actively self-censoring and not saying what they think for fear of the social consequences. And so, yeah, I'm sad to admit that at times that is me, because as I've realized, it's a bit of a grisly world sometimes when these free speech arguments are not easy arguments to have, and they're incredibly emotive and often incredibly divisive. I do come at them in good faith. I know that others don't necessarily do so. But yeah, Niloo, have you lost friends?
Yeah, I have. In part because I'm kind of a loudmouth, and so I have a hard time just keeping my opinions to myself. But also, I think the friends I lost, it wasn't very many. It was maybe a couple friends, but the one in particular that always stuck out to me, it was that they were very adamant about changing my mind. And it was tough because I was okay with us disagreeing and continuing our friendship in just a regular way, but he just wasn't. Like, he was very adamant about changing my mind, and it was almost like it's like having someone constantly eager to indoctrinate you, and whether that's into a religion or into an ideology, it's very frustrating once you express that you're not interested for them to continue doing that. And I wasn't trying to return that kind of energy, and so it was very frustrating.
Yeah. And do you resonate with the experiences, Niloo, of Sam and Emma, in their respective universities and countries, of this culture of self-repression on campus? Did you experience that as well?
Yes and no. I think I experienced it in the sense that I understood that there was certain things I wasn't allowed to say, whether that was about the gender ideology or, I mean, really even just talking about anything relatively conservative. It was kind of frowned upon, especially in the west coast of Canada where I am. But I also challenged myself to kind of not give into it. And so I would say the unpopular thing. I also just happened to not make a lot of friends in university. So it was fine. I kept to myself, and, I said what I said and I did what I did. But I do think that, especially in Canada, it was particularly frustrating because we don't have free speech as a protected, like, it's not protected in our law. We have freedom of expression, which is protected. And there's actually quite a heavy load of censorship surrounding what you can say, and like obscenity laws and stuff like that. And so it just wasn't a quality we had growing up. I think it was just kind of like something we imported from American politics, and we assumed it would apply to us because we're Western and we're in the Anglosphere, but it never was.
Interesting. So, Stephen, how do you feel about, like, how does it land with you that people on other sides of the world, in the UK and in Canada, are having experiences that Emma describes in her article as well?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'm just not surprised. I think we have grown up in, I think, a society and a time that we've not fully appreciated sort of the soft power being wielded against us as individuals. And I think, most of us as intellectual dissidents, I think there's a narrative that's being pushed, I think, by, elite in a couple of countries. And we are sort of going against that. And so when you have, this mass media that is always pushing an angle on both sides, it becomes tough for I think all of us to sort of, think independently. And then when you hear so much so often, to come against conflict is really sort of, it's hurtful, it's confusing, and so people don't know how to react. And so sometimes, what happens is strife. And I think this describes a lot of what's happened. I mean, to me, and I guess as I'm listening to some of the people on this panel as well, I think there are even people, again, on both sides, though, that recognize this is a problem. I go back to my experience, as Sam said, in the BLM summer. I actually had a lot of friends who were at those protests, and who didn't actually conform to the message that was sort of being put on the protests. These people, from my understanding, I spent a decent amount of time with them, and they just wanted to be left alone. They wanted to be left alone, by the government and sort of the big business that was sort of forcing this on them. And I think so across the aisle, there's sort of a message being sort of pushed by those in power that does not necessarily, match up with what we as individuals and what we as, I think as, nascent intellectuals really think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so, Stephen, what BLM summer, were you still in high school when that was taking place? So that's interesting. Do you think that, I don't know, the self-censorship that you're experiencing, at the University of Virginia now, is that comparable to what you're experiencing in high school as well? Or do you feel like one territory is worse than the other? Does it depend on the educational setting or maybe the state that you're in?
Yeah, I think it also depends on who you surround yourself with. I was very outspoken in high school, and I think I maybe I should have maybe self-censored is the wrong word, but been a bit more cognizant of what I said. But I was very shameless in what I said, and so I encountered a lot of conflict with other people. Coming into college, though, I sort of realized that maybe I want to be more neutral and just to meet more people. And that worked for a little bit. But then I realized that I needed to, I hate the cliche, but to stay true to myself. But I think thankfully I had already found a wonderful group of friends, even those in especially in the Jefferson and Literary Debating Society, which Em and I are a part of. But also in some other organizations where there was tension when I started being fairly honest with what I believed, but ultimately in those other groups we've really sort of reached an understanding, and that that is fruitful, but it's still sort of relatively unnerving that that even needed to happen, and that it was kind of up in the air as to whether I would be able to continue to be in specific spheres of my college life because of the article and my opinions.
Right. So what about the rest of you, Sam, Niloo, Emma? Do you feel like a lot has changed since high school in terms of the censorship that you experience or the way you can express yourself? Because I know that Stephen is just at the beginning of his university career, whereas the three of you are ending it now. So, especially, I guess this question is directed especially at you, Emma, because you do write about your experience at university, but I do wonder if it was like that the whole way through, so all 4 years or not.
I definitely think there's a marked difference between pre-summer 2020, post-summer 2020. I think part of it has to do with the Black Lives Matter protests. I think part of it has to do with the ways in which I think the pandemic kept everyone home. And so a lot of interactions that people would have been having face-to-face, they were having online. And I think people are willing to be much more aggressive, much more demanding, much more, frankly, vile online than they are to a person. And so I think it completely changed the tenor around political discussions. I noticed a dramatic difference basically in the kinds of demands that people were willing to make and just kind of the way activism worked on grounds. This idea of if someone does something wrong, campaigns to get them expelled from the university, of these kind of demands letters with increasing frequency. And I think really a lot of I'm not sure if this is really the case in everyday American life, but I think in kind of the quote unquote elite circles of America, i.e. universities, large companies, the tenor of certain anti-racism activism, and I'm not confusing this with like genuine, like, yes, there is racism, say in the police force, we need to fix this. Like the activism that calls itself anti-racism or anti-racist activism that is extremely illiberal and is predicated on the idea that things like free speech are antithetical to freedom and pro-white supremacy. I'm thinking of the kind of I think Derek Bell is his name, Ibram X. Kendi, Ron DeAngelo style anti-racism that's very anti-free speech, anti-diversity of thought, the idea that anything that is not anti-racist is white supremacist, that like very all or nothing style of activism and style of talking about progressive activism kind of took over the whole machine, and made a lot of conversations much more difficult to have. And I think people being much more willing to say, call certain names. I think an interesting dynamic that I've seen is this changing in the definition of racism. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, calling someone racist shouldn't be that big a deal because so many things can be racist, right? But at the same time, you know, and therefore you shouldn't defend yourself from such an accusation. At the same time, it is this really terrible kind of life-altering accusation. So shouldn't people be able to defend themselves against it? Shouldn't we take it seriously? And so I think the changing of terms has also allowed for this increased amount of kind of name calling, which I think also kind of gums up debate, makes people scared because they don't want to be labeled as a blankist. And I think that happened within my college career. I think in terms of high school, that's different. I think a lot of that has to do with just the laws in the US. So public universities in the United States are held to First Amendment standards, which you don't get freer speech basically anywhere else in the world, right? So you can say basically whatever you want, right? You have to be essentially standing in front of a mob with pitchforks saying, you know, go get this person and kill them for your speech to be illegal, which is great. Public universities don't always abide by the First Amendment, but if they don't, they can be sued and they usually lose. High schools are a bit different. I don't remember the standard off the top of my head, but high school students in public schools have a fair amount of free speech rights. They just can't be disruptive. And that line is looser. Their off-campus speech can't really be regulated, again, without evidence that it will be very disruptive, which was decided in a Supreme Court case a year ago. And so high school, I think, was different for me. I think, frankly, because I believe different things in high school. So I am from Alabama, which is one of the most conservative states in the United States. But at the same time, I went to one of the most liberal high schools in America. I went to a fine arts focused magnet public school. And I was also, granted, I do think what it means to be left-wing in America has changed a lot since when I was in high school. But for a teenager in Alabama, I was very left-wing. You know, I supported all of the kind of left-wing issues. I walked out, I participated in the walkout against gun violence. You know, I cried when Donald Trump won. You know, I did all of the kind of left wing. When Alabama passed a law banning abortion, I was at the pro-choice rally. And so I had kind of the smug feeling of being better than a lot of the people around me because of stereotypes about conservatives in Alabama. But at the same time, I went to a high school where everyone believed what I believed, right? Where it was very liberal. The teachers wore pronoun pins half the time. And I think if I went to that high school now where my beliefs are, I wouldn't identify as a conservative per se, but they're definitely much more complicated and much less evenly sortable as partisan. My experience would probably be different in the things that I felt I could say and do. But in high school, it was great. You know, I picked all the fights I wanted and didn't really care because I was kind of in the majority, right?
Right. Well, that's really interesting. What about Niloo? I see you unmuted yourself. You have something to say in response to Emma.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about censorship in academia, a lot of the time we talk about politics and, whether the institution has a left-leaning ideology or right-leaning ideology and conforming to that. But what happened to me wasn't political. It was very apolitical. And I think that's why the censorship for me was so stark, because in my first year of university, I was trying to sign up for a debate club because I want to go to law school, and so did many other people. My school is almost exclusively Sikh and Punjabi students. And so, there isn't some rampant white supremacy agenda going on. We're multicultural. We don't have white supremacy in Canada, really. I've never known a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knew a Nazi. But when I pitched, we should open up a debate club, my university said no, because we've had some problems in the past. And I was very clear that the way a debate club would be run would be very traditional. You don't know if you're pro or con on the topic until you arrive there that day. So you have to prepare for both. It's an exercise to be prepared to speak on either or. And again, the interest was from people who were going to law school, anywhere from, interest in the first year all the way to fourth year, like people studying for the LSATs. And they said no. And so we had to pitch it again as a model UN and lie and say it was a model UN, basically, in order to just have a regular debate club. And we never debated anything that was overtly political. Like, we weren't having pro-life, pro-choice debates or whatever. I mean, our debates were actually quite silly, just to kind of challenge ourselves and see how far can you take a debate if the debate is bananas over oranges. I mean, you got to get really deep into like the nutritional details of what you're talking about. And for some reason, the school was just really, they never caught on because they don't follow up. There isn't that many people following up with the clubs, but it was very interesting to me because the censorship was very top down, and it was almost like they were afraid. Like, they didn't want to deal with a lawsuit, or they didn't want to deal with a protest or whatever. And it was just kind of shocking to me, again, because it was never that deep. And they wanted to make it that deep. And I think that actually put a bad taste in everyone's mouths. And a lot of these people, again, were international students. They were people that just arrived to Canada, and they're being told that you can't have a debate. You can't have free speech at a university. Yeah, and it was very frustrating. And so I don't think that it's necessarily even a political thing. I think that it's just the fear of it even becoming political. Like, people are just so afraid of it even going there, even when it's not. And I think that's something that really frightened me.
Yeah, I mean, I think just building on that, what I would say is that it's incredibly easy and perhaps tempting to turn free speech on campus debates into a partisan issue. I think we're perhaps even so far tonight a bit guilty of it. It's easy to bash these woke snowflake students and say, oh, I should be able to say X, Y, and Z as a conservative, but I'm not able to. It's the left this, left that. That's an easy and attractive attack line. However, I think it doesn't help the debate at all. And we've got to try and be able to, we've got to work to promote freedom of speech and academic freedom as a universal. And yes, it might seem at the moment as though it seems to be the right who are suffering at the hands of censorship. But yeah, if we can't argue for it as a universal and happy to utilize anti-woke bashing and stuff like that, then all we're going to do is alienate even more people. And trust me, there are already enough people who are alienated towards any idea of freedom of speech because they immediately see it as a right-wing thing. And so, yeah, it's easy to kind of, I agree with what Emma was saying about there being a tangible difference post summer 2020. Definitely, that was the normalization of all of those anti-racist thinkers that that Emma listed off, and when they became kind of in the public psyche. But I think whilst that is all true, it's definitely been bubbling away for far, far longer than that. You know, people trace it back to the Long March to the institutions in the 60s and 70s and stuff like that. And, you know, I think about how much stuff was written about this before summer of 2020, and it's easy to forget that because it is very easy to just pin everything on that summer. But so yeah, I think we need to just really rediscover that ability and keep in the forefront of our minds that the importance of freedom of speech as a universal principle and not as some sort of partisan issue.
Yeah. I totally agree with that, Sam. That's exactly what the free speech champions stand for. And I think that related to that is the question, right, of having some type of legislation that protects the principle of free speech. So regardless of which way the winds of politics blow. And of course, Stephen and Emma have the First Amendment, you know, the Rolls-Royce protection of free speech. And here in the UK, I know that we have oncoming the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill, which will provide legal remedies if a university or a student union doesn't adequately protect free speech. So what I'm wondering, Sam, is if you think that this will be an effective tool to tackle censorship, because, you know, all of us who have read Emma's article, you know, and are kind of aware of what's going on in the US, know that despite this First Amendment protection, there's still a lot going on in terms of people that are countering free speech, the principle. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. And I'm also curious, Niloo, to get your input on what the situation is like in Canada and whether or not you think that legislation would be helpful in protecting the principle of free speech.
So I think I would characterize my position as kind of one of a reluctant acceptance that that the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill is something that we should pursue. My instinct is to, you know, I don't like the idea that we're having to legislate for this. Wouldn't it be nice if we were just able to win the argument with our words and convince everyone that a culture of free speech on campus is something that we should actively be cherishing, well, promoting and then cherishing. I think sadly that, you know, it was all of our experiences testifying to that is a world far, far away from the one that we find ourselves in. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the legislation, if anything, we do the pro-free speech lobby, we need to almost rediscover a bit of that, the dirty tactics, if you like, that our opponents are so willing to throw at us. And so I think, you know, having something to fall back on that's not just, you know, coming back to the classic arguments for freedom of speech, having legislation which we can fall back on, which should, if it does what it says it does, you know, prevent speakers from being no platformed at incredibly short notices. And it should actively promote the idea of academic freedom in our institutions of higher education. So it sounds good. I think another of my hesitations come from the fact that, you know, it's easy to, well, I think that this government in the UK here, the Tory government, are quite good at choosing the culture war fronts that they wish to fight. This is definitely one of them. And so it does, you know, this legislation, I think it turns it into a partisan issue. You know, we all know how much students hate the Tories. And if anything, what we've got is Tory legislation, or it's easy to frame it as Tory legislation being imposed upon students who actually hate the Tories. So I think it could just rile people up even further against it. But yeah, I mean, let's see how it goes. Yeah, reluctant acceptance. It shouldn't have had to come to this, but if that's what we need to try to keep turning the tide, then so be it. But I mean, what I would say, just to finish this little segment, is that isn't it wonderful that we've got groups such as this and events such as this? You know, we don't need a higher education freedom of speech bill to to have these conversations. And it's grassroots movements such as this and students such as us that that can turn the tide without the legislation.
Niloo?
Yeah, I think it's hard because in Canada, I don't believe we have any legislation like that in the works. And if we did, I think there's a lot of people, myself included, that we just don't trust the government to uphold it, even if it was it's put into law. I mean, one of our constitutional rights, it's in our Bill of Rights in Canada, is religious freedom. And during COVID, church services were interrupted throughout Canada, and it's a federal crime to do that. And so, you know, like we have rules that break the laws, and there's all these loopholes, and no one really knows what's going on. And the government's, and not just the liberal government, but the conservative government, when they were in power as well, like they've just been so consistently negligent and irresponsible that I think a lot of people are just, we don't have faith that even if a bill was passed and it was good, that it would be upheld. And that's really unfortunate. I do have more hope for the UK and for the USA. And so I do think that because Canada tends to absorb whatever happens in those countries, I hope that if we're watching you guys on a free speech trajectory, it'll promote it here a bit more. But I don't think that a legal avenue is necessarily the correct way. I think we need a cultural change in Canada. I mean, we have maybe 30 million people. There's more people in California than all of Canada. If we could get those people to think freely and speak freely, I think the government would then have to follow. I think we need something that's more of a cultural change. It's not really going to be something that can be mandated top down.
Interesting. Stephen, what do you think? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I really think that's a really sort of important perspective. I think, unfortunately, you have to trust the state to regulate itself when it makes, constitutional promises and then legislation. And unfortunately, I think the last 2 years of COVID lockdowns and, protest suppression and all of this really, to me, indicates that our current states in the Anglosphere are not capable of doing that, unfortunately. And I think, we should realize that a lot of the culture around free speech, sort of this bottom-up opinion, comes from, as we've sort of established, this idea that culture depends on a lot of this, and we've got to make sure that the cultural and informal institutions in our societies are going to support free speech. I think to go off something what Sam said about, sort of being realistic about this fight that we're entering. There's sort of an anti-liberal, thought, liberal with a big L philosophically, thinker right now, Sarab Ahmari, who has, some opinions on free speech that I really don't agree with, but he has this idea that, we need to be fighting this sort of culture war with a realism. We need to be creating sort of separate institutions like this that really value free speech. And I think we need to do that. We need to be aware of the maneuvers against us and, bringing up, grassroots support against free speech. And we need to sort of realize how to rally people to this idea that, no, we shouldn't be closing the intellectual orthodoxy up. And we need to be opening it up and making sure that those, at the intellectual and, political top can be questioned and can be brought down a bit. And I think, we need to be sort of play this, cultural realism game of realizing that, it starts with, changing the culture, which can then, go on to influence the rest of society and the environment that we all live in.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really powerful. And I think this is a good moment also to mention that the champions are going to be joining other young people concerned about freedom at a very special 2-day summer school in London at the end of June. And so we'll be having lectures and workshops and socializing around the theme of freedom. So we are all gathering together to discuss all the issues that we've been talking about now and many others. So I think it would be, if anyone is interested, there's a short application process, but nothing to be scared off from. And I'll have Jan post the link in the chat if anybody wants to apply and be part of it. Because I do agree with what you're all saying, which is that we definitely do need a grassroots, collection of people that genuinely care about the principle of free speech and putting it into practice to discuss difficult ideas. So in a safe space. So Emma, do you have any final thoughts on how we can best tackle the issue that you describe in your article from both a university perspective and a student perspective as well, like the individual student and the university?
I mean, I think it's interesting seeing just legally the big gaps between the US and other countries, because I think in the United States, the issue of free speech is very much a cultural issue a lot of times, because it's so ingrained legally that it's protected, right? American school children, when they get in fights, say, well, it's a free country, right? They say that to each other. And so oftentimes when people talk about free speech and free expression, something that's sometimes quite frustrating to me is when, no matter how many times you say you're talking about a culture of free speech and free expression and the kind of cultural issue, people say, well, legally, you can say whatever you want. It's like, yes, of course you can. Certain behavioral responses don't have negative impacts we should think about and talk about. So when I think that the United States, I think it's often kind of a cultural issue. But it seems like in other places like UK and Canada, it's very much a legal issue as well, right? It's that you literally can't say what you want because your university will punish you, or even, law enforcement might get involved if you say other specific things. And so I think when it comes to what students in universities should do, I mean, lobbying for legislative change, I think, is one thing. I'm not familiar enough with kind of the issue abroad to be able to make really helpful prescriptions. But I think it is a very difficult line to toe to advocate for something that you don't have a legal right to, and something that is both a cultural and a legal issue at the same time. And the fact that, having legislation won't fix a lot of your problems, but it provides some kind of justification. So I think it's really complex. And so I guess in the United States is to keep advocating for cultural change. And I think for universities to, and I guess this can apply to universities abroad, to take very strong pro free expression stances and to not cave to unreasonable student demands. Because a lot of times, so I guess going back to what Sam was saying about free speech as kind of a partisan issue, I find it very frustrating when it's talked about as a partisan issue as well. It changes over time. But right now, the general trend in the United States is that students make demands to punish conservative speech. And when there are outside demands from, say, conservative online mobs, universities will kowtow to those and punish liberal speech. Universities just need to ignore the mobs, fundamentally, whether if it's liberal students or even conservative students saying, punish this person, or liberal or conservative outsiders saying punish this professor, whatever. Universities need to tell them to take a hike. And I think they're really afraid a lot of times. I think administrators are not trained in this. I think they're fundamentally trained to be administrators, right? To be bureaucrats who punch numbers. And so I think they're faced with online mobs. They mainly want it to go away, right? They have this kind of PR perspective where, well, what protects the reputation of the university is making it go away, when really what protects the reputation of the university is not kowtowing to demands for censorship.
Well said, well said. Sam?
Yeah, so I just wanted to tap into something that I think hasn't really been discussed yet, and that was in a really enlightening conversation with academics at the University of Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago, which I know a couple of the audience members here were also present at. It was really interesting to hear their perspective on academic freedom and freedom of speech on campus, and how actually it's a problem less so necessarily to do with the culture amongst students, and as much so amongst the culture within academics. And they were trying to say that it's not necessarily their fault. It's the institutions. So the University of Edinburgh, as with most UK universities, all young tutors and young academics pursuing a career in academia, they're on the flimsiest of contracts. They're desperate for every single promotion they can possibly get, and so that their career can progress as much as possible. And in order to do that, they are just so scared of well, sorry, that's the wrong way to put it. Why would, if they're after all of these promotions, why would they do anything vaguely controversial that could even begin to jeopardize their chances of getting that promotion? They just want to be seen to have their heads down and doing everything they're told to do and not causing a stir. It's easy for, you know, these middle-aged professors who are already set in their careers to then suddenly have some more controversial opinions. But if you're a, you know, someone pursuing a career in academia in their late 20s, then there is no incentive. There's literally no incentive to have tricky conversations or vaguely controversial conversations in the classroom at university. And so, well, without wanting to sound like the most progressive of activists out there, we do need system change. I genuinely believe that higher education in the UK is broken. One of the results of that is what we see with the freedom of speech on campus issue. There are many others which we don't need to discuss now. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to consider how academics themselves, the incentive to stir up any kind of conversation on these tricky issues just isn't there, and that needs to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the same could be said of students as well when it comes to the types of work that they submit to particular tutors, and, you know, how willing they are to also, you know, stick their neck over the parapet as well, you know, like Emma did, which I would like to ask about as well, as what actually brought you to write the article, what gave you the courage to write the article, because you must have had at least some understanding that there would be a backlash. And after that, I will throw it out there to the audience, and we'll start the Q&A section. So.
Yeah, to write the article was it was just a topic I've been interested in for a while. I've been involved in kind of the free speech activism for a bit at my university, and I had an editorial assistant at the Times reach out to me because she had read some stuff I'd written in the school newspaper and liked it and thought I might pitch something. And it was just the first topic that came to mind. It was something I felt I could speak on with authority, because obviously when it comes to kind of the free speech on campus issues, I wasn't qualified to talk about it from a legal perspective, nor from, you know, a perspective of a professor. So I think a student talking about how students talk to each other was a good topic, and I'm glad I wrote about it.
Awesome, thank you, Emma. So we'll start the Q&A portion of tonight. I see that Hal has had his hand up for a while. So if you would like to give us your question, I'll probably take a few questions at a time. So anybody that does have questions, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate all you coming together today. Currently, my old home high school. I'm now a post-grad student, but my old home high school in the United States recently, and it's kind of surprising because it's a relatively liberal, affluent area. That area, they just had a series of book bans by kind of a right-wing school board that was installed, and we've seen this across the country. And what's kind of fascinating to me is both the people on the right and people on the left kind of before have used this argument that reading certain books or other material or watching certain videos are like they would either need trigger warnings or they're traumatizing in some way, shape, or form. And I think this has probably been increased by the whole digital world as well, where people interpret like online rhetoric with real violence when everything else has kind of been translated into online speak. And I guess I just had the question of, have any of you come across this argument that speech online or speech through a book or any of these things that aren't obviously physically harming people are violent in some way? And how do you think people can really rebut that claim, especially when people are like increasingly interpreting things this way, and it's kind of easier to do so than ever before in the digital age?
Oh yes, I see this claim all the time, especially for online speech. And I think really the best way to rebut the idea that speech is violence is, well, I guess like the fundamental logic of it, right, is that if you read speech that upsets you, that causes you emotional harm, it's really the idea that like bad emotions are the same thing as physical violence. Right. And it often comes from this idea that, well, when we're emotionally wounded, it causes us to feel all of these negative things and maybe, causes us to be depressed, which has all these symptoms. And therefore, that's the same thing as being physically hurt. Right. Because mental illness, say, is the same as physical illness. And I think an easy way to dispel that is to say, like, well, there are lots of ways in which we can emotionally, hurt each other that are clearly not violence. Right. Like if you break up with your girlfriend and you break her heart and she gets upset, maybe even is depressed, you clearly haven't done violence to her, right? It wouldn't be fair to say that it's violent to break up with your partner, even though that causes emotional distress, right? And so I think that's part of it. And then also to say like, no, like we can still say that like the emotional effects that our speech has are real, right? And should be considered. But that's not the same thing as violence, right? Something can be worthy of condemnation and not be worthy of the same condemnation that violence is, right? If someone says something terrible online, we can say like, that's not a nice thing to say. That's not a good thing to say, but we shouldn't regulate in the same way we would regulate if that person came over and stabbed you. And so I think it's a rhetorical turn that I think people use to exaggerate harms and to justify censorship, right? Because if physical violence is illegal, shouldn't verbal violence be illegal too? And so I think the best way to rebut it is just to decouple that fundamental claim that emotional distress is the same as physical distress.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in there, I mean, words can be, I think this is, and as a conservative, I say this very lightly, I do think words can be violent in the sense that you can be like psychologically, verbally abusive to someone. I would consider that like sort of close to violence, but it's not, but it's already prohibited in the Anglosphere. Like we already have laws against hate speech. We already have laws against stuff like that. Like you can't just constantly belittle someone and not be faced with some kind of repercussions, right? Like if not in a legal sense, at the very least, the person will walk away from you and you no longer have that person to victimize. And so I do think that the left, it's typically used by them as a talking point. Like they do have some merit there where like, yeah, words can be dangerous. You can incite violence with words. Words should be taken seriously. I don't think that we should act as if they don't have consequences either. But I mean, anyone who thinks that a hurtful comment is worse than a punch to the face has never been punched in the face, right? I mean, I did boxing and wrestling for a long time. And if I'm caught in a chokehold or I get hit, I mean, it sucks, but it sucks a lot more than if somebody, before the fight says something to me. Like, I don't really care about that. And so I mean, it's a hot topic for sure, but I don't know. I think that it's kind of hard to say that words don't have any value because which is not what you said, but like, I think it's hard to say that they're not hurtful and that it can't be as hurtful, because if you're a child, for instance, right, like, and somebody like a parent, like a guardian is constantly belittling you, that is going to have deep psychological effects for you later in your life. And I don't think that that's something that should be like, oh, well, you should just brush it off, because I don't think it's something that they can just brush off. But yeah,
I think that's a good point, Niloo. And I think it also matters in terms of the consistency and the frequency that something is being said to you by the same person, and I think that's what often makes the difference between something that's harassment and something that's a one-off type of thing. So But really great question, Hal. I'll ask Moshe next. You've had your hand up for a while if you want to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. What I'm interested in getting the reaction of the speakers on it is how has this happened? I mean, I'm a little bit older than the other people in this discussion, and I grew up in a time when I thought the discussion about freedom of speech was over. You know, you would never find anybody saying, oh, you know, we don't need freedom of speech. You know, I grew up in the UK and I'm also Israeli, and like, I never even thought this question would ever be raised again. I mean, we saw the fall of the communism, and we were just on a wave of freedom. So, you know, does anybody have a theory of how this has happened?
Stephen?
Yeah, so the theory that I've come across that I think it has been most persuasive for me, and I'm sort of still trying to figure this out, is the idea that it's the rise of mass organizations, really. And as these sort of organizations rise, they come with them an ideology. And much like sort of a lot of elite circulation throughout all of history, you have an orthodox that rises through these institutions and then seeks to maintain that hegemony. I think, again, you can see this primarily in mass media. They primarily have sort of one angle that they want to take from it. Even if, you know, you look at, you know, both conservative and left media, I think they have a lot of the same implicit assumptions. And then this derives sort of ideological homogeneity. And so, you know, once institutions like this take hold and you have large, you know, monetary institutions in the United States, you know, like the Ford Institution and Tides and, you know, maybe the Koch brothers, if you want to throw that name in there, you have this sort of one general direction that most institutions tend to trend. And then I think it's beneficial for those organizations to close off sort of the circulation into the elite, if you will. And so to sort of destroy freedom such as freedom of expression, it makes sort of ideological homogeneity much easier to achieve. And then when you have people coming along with sort of dissident ideas that are radical and want to challenge the status quo, that makes things rather problematic for, you know, I think a transnational elite, you know, maybe in, you know, some sort of idea of late stage capitalism. It makes it very easy for this to sort of form and to be problematic. And that is sort of the macro theory that I have best seen that has fit this. But I've also, you know, seen a lot of others. And of course, there's a lot of, you know, downstream from this culture that spawns. So, you know, Emma probably has some more ideas on this. We've talked on this subject a little bit, but there's culture things that sort of come down from this, you know, the rise of mass organizations, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's a slightly simpler explanation as well that I find persuasive and is kind of argued for by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt in their book, Coddling of the American Mind, kind of specifically how this kind of anti-liberal, anti-free speech ideas kind of rose to prominence on college campuses specifically. And I think this specific iteration of it, because of course we did have the first speech codes in the so-called like PC era in the 90s, but this specific iteration of it, which started happening kind of around 2013. And it's basically a combination of social media and what social media allows us to do to each other. This kind of idea of being canceled was much harder to have happened to you before social media. I mean, you can find cases of people, I think Monica Lewinsky is probably a good example of someone who was canceled and kind of had this mob pre-social media, but that was a much rarer thing to have happen to you, and it would happen with much larger incidents. Now, the way social media works, where you have these kind of anonymous mobs that can form and the ways in which people can gain kind of social capital by being seen, kind of being on the right side, dunking on someone, kind of combined with very specifically the child rearing environment under which Generation Z was raised. Basically the idea that our generation, had access to social media at a very young age, which was able to turn our brains to Swiss cheese. And then also the ways in which our parents raised us, where, so in America, Gen Z kids had much less time outside, much less unsupervised time. And so a lot of kids, particularly middle class kids, because this isn't really true with working or lower class kids, middle class and above children never really had unsupervised time. And that's where you learn to argue, right? When you're alone with other kids and a fight breaks out, you have to solve it amongst yourselves because there's no adult you can go to. But when there's all of this fear mongering about what will happen if you leave children alone, you can always have an adult that you can appeal to. And so I think that and the kind of increased duration of childhood and adolescence leads to a situation where you have these young people going to college where, you know, when some ideological battle breaks out, when some argument occurs, they appeal to university administrations. And I think that's increasingly likely to happen because starting around 2013, 2015, the rates of reported depression and anxiety symptoms, possibly caused by social media, the causation for that isn't certain yet, skyrocketed among young people, right? And so someone who's depressed and anxious, I think, is even more likely to have this kind of outsized irrational reaction to something their peer posts on social media. You know, that we, the organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, which I intern for, you know, they see cases like this happen all the time, where student A posts something on social media that someone finds offensive, you know, say they're posing with a gun or something that someone finds offensive. Student B or group of students B are upset by this, they're offended by this, and they appeal to the university and they demand that the university punish the student and the university kowtows. So it's this kind of, and they do it because the social media mob has gathered. It isn't one student who goes to your office to complain, it's thousands of people online. So that's sort of the simpler explanation, is that it's a combination of social media and the specific way in which Gen Z young people were raised.
If I could quickly add, I think even simpler perhaps, I think it's just a massive sense of complacency amongst my generation and my fellow peers at university. Like, dare I say it, I might be completely wrong here, but I don't think a lot of students could tell you when the Berlin Wall fell. You know, I think that that we have grown up in an age where we have been so free and our freedoms have been so taken for granted that it's incredibly easy for us to lose sight of what it means to be free. And so I think that is where my generation have really suffered and why we find ourselves in the position we are in today, because we're just so complacent.
But I do think that it's not, I think it's very easy to be like, oh, well, it's our generation. But I mean, we were raised by a culture, we were raised in these institutions. And I think that the institutions are where a lot of this kind of stuff is coming from. I mean, there was, oh gosh, I don't remember the name of the company. It was Jim Morrison or something. Anyways, there was a billboard in Vancouver a few years ago, and it was just the definition of a woman. And there was one complaint and it got taken down. And so it wasn't this online mob of people, like it wasn't thousands or even a dozen people complaining. It was one guy who complained and it was removed immediately, like within the night, like less than 24 hours, this billboard was taken down. And so I do think that we need to really scrutinize these institutions and our teachers. I mean, it's, you know, it's easy to be like, oh, well, a 13-year-old can Google when the Berlin Wall fell, but, you know, they shouldn't have to just Google it. They should be taught in their schools by their teachers, but the teachers aren't teaching that. I mean, in Canada, it's mandatory to take French from 4th grade to 10th grade. And then after 10th grade, you get to decide which second language you want to study. And the entire time, we learned how to count to 100, and we learned very basic vocabulary. I mean, we weren't taught how to put things into sentences. And then it's a prerequisite if you want to take a government position to speak French. So you can't apply for any job in government, including accounting and stuff. Like, it doesn't have to be like a political thing. You need to speak French to do it. And so they basically have consistently, in every avenue, in every subject, set up kids to not succeed. and then they're surprised when they get to university and then they try to like appeal to authority because they don't really know what else to do. We were never taught.
Those are all really interesting perspectives, and I think we got a little bit of everything in there, you know, how we behave generally, you know, within our generation, the responsibility of the institutions, you know, that we grew up in, and also, you know, getting a perspective of how it is in the different countries as well, because I think that makes a difference. I think within the US, probably even what state you're in makes a difference in terms of how you grow up and how you perceive, you know, freedom and free speech. But I'm going to go back to the audience and gather a couple of questions before taking it back to the panel. So I know that Matthew Brown, you've had your hand up for a while. If you want to ask your question, and then after that, we'll go to free speech champion Rob Lowy.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for organizing this, by the way. It's been excellent. This is less of a question, more of an observation and an argument, which actually ties into Mosh's question and all the excellent points that you've just made. I've written this down, so bear with me. So infringements on free speech, while undoubtedly occurring on both the left and the right, I think it is fair to say that the greatest proportion of limitations on free speech are undertaken in service of stifling dissent aimed at the arguments and prescriptions of critical theorists. They are the radical neo-Marxist postmodern movement that has situated itself in opposition to the cultural foundations of Western liberal civilization. It is these who are using the strengths and weaknesses of the West against itself. And by that, I mean they are using the values of academic freedom and freedom of speech to cynically and incessantly criticize the West and to theorize on its dissolution, as is their right, while simultaneously engaging in an attempt to dissolve the West by bringing their abstract theory into concrete practice, insisting on the political urgency of the application of their prescriptions, arguing that one is either upholding the West or actively pushing back against it. There is no neutral position. This, in my opinion, and this is, I'd love to hear all your thoughts on this, is a case that ought not to be protected under academic freedom of speech. I know that's complicated, but we come back to that. I do not say this lightly, and to justify this, we are not as free to act as we are to speak. So theorizing radical societal reorganization, as is their right, however, engaging in radical societal reorganization undemocratically using academia as a tool is not their right. This practice, which includes the stifling of dissent, is a dishonest trick played by those who have no respect for the Western liberal values of academic freedom, freedom of speech, and freedom in general, who are deserving not of the benefit of the doubt, but instead the immense scrutiny they are more happy to dish out than to receive. The issue with freedom of speech, which we are here to discuss, in all of our countries, it seems to me, is a symptom of a much larger problem, that of a multi-generational endeavor to dissolve the West using whichever means that are politically expedient, as is the critical theorists' stated aims. And I refer you all to a book called The Critical Turn in Education by Isaac Gottsman, where this is all detailed. Just one last final point. One is free to think like a Nazi and speak like a Nazi. One is not free to act like one, that is, to implement its ideals. And I see no reason why the same standard ought not to apply to Marxists and postmodernists.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that question. I'll just quickly get a couple more questions from the audience. So, or at least one more. Rob, I'll ask you, and then we'll throw it back to the panel.
Thanks very much. As many have said, that was a really interesting discussion. It might be slightly reductive to reduce this to a kind of chicken and egg thing of what came first. But I thought it was interesting that Sam mentioned the kind of the long march through the institutions and the idea that this might be something that's kind of come from the top downwards, whereas a lot of the discussion tonight has implied that university policy has been informed by student attitudes, that it's kind of, you know, that the students are having more say. So I wanted to ask the panel how they feel about this, whether one has informed the other or it's the other way around, or whether it's a kind of sort of coexistence of the two. And within that, has there been a kind of sea shift in terms of how much influence students have over both kind of curriculum change and indeed kind of general policies on free speech?
great question, Rob. So does anybody want to pick up on either of the questions that were just asked?
Yeah, so if nobody else would, I'll go really quickly. I think it's important to sort of keep in mind, and I think I'll go back to my articulation, that a lot of these ideas that we've discussed, complacency, academia caving to online mobs, the desire, having to speak French to get a managerial position in government, I think is all downstream from a theory by James Burnham called the Managerial Revolution, which says that there's this managerial class that comes in and wants to manage a lot of things in society, and that the unparalleled, this drive for efficiency causes all of these sort of problematic breakdowns of social cohesion in society. And I think when we're to go to this question about the radical reorganization of Marxism in society, I think you're looking a lot more at an elite, which is, I really don't think it's Marxist in any way. It's definitely liberal in a sense. Like there is a drive leftwards, but it's a very controlled and perpetual march leftwards. And I think that I know Emma and I know a couple of Marxists, and I don't think that those Marxists would say that what we are living under currently is what they wanted, or what the ideal would be. And so I think there's something else going on here. And to the question of, is it a change from the top or the bottom? I think it's actually both. It's the term that I've seen sort of used to describe this is maybe the Caesarist option. There are a group of elites who are using an underclass sort of, maybe not an underclass, but sort of the masses to do their bidding and to sort of wage this cultural war against the middle. And I think that this is probably more likely that you have one or two, you have these cultural managerial elites that are using the power of the people to sort of stifle their opposition in other sort of subalternate elite structures. I know that's very sort of very theoretical and hard to grab onto tangibly, but I think it's, once you sort of apply this theory, you might start to see where it's starting to fit in maybe. So hopefully that answers some of the questions.
Yeah, and I think to Matthew's question, I just think I disagree with his assertion. I think that we ought to protect speech, which calls for the end to free speech. That's just what it means to actually have free speech protections. I think maybe a way in which because I think I'm also, I was a little confused by the term implement, right? The idea of acting. If acting is just, writing academic papers, which might persuade people, I think that should be protected under academic freedom, right? The hope is that the free speech case will make a better case, will be more persuasive. But we have to allow both sides of the debate, even if we find one of them reprehensible, right? This is why I believe Holocaust denial is illegal in the UK. I think it should be legal in the US, even if I find it reprehensible. But, I think one element of that in which maybe I might agree is, these theorists or whatever, I would like them to not be able to actually change policy, right? This is why it's good to have legal protections for free speech. I'm obviously speaking from an American perspective. In America at the University of Virginia, if some professor wanted to say, you will get expelled if you say the wrong thing, if you don't agree with these assertions that I've made, that would be illegal, right? So I think that that's good. But I think that isn't special. That's just a consistent legal protection for free speech.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the interesting dialogue between the panelists. I'll just turn now to Nico's question and Julia's question. So Nico, you can go first.
Yeah, hi there. Just to come in on the how did this happen, which was Moish's question. I think this alludes to Stephen's comment about the James Burnham book and the Managerial Revolution. I think there is a sort of a theory not unrelated to some of the theories that have been discussed about the rise of the new class, or the professional managerial class, and perhaps a way in which kind of traditional class structure in society is being superseded by people who manage capital but don't own capital. And you might refer to Catherine Liu, who's a professor in, I can't remember which institution in California, who wrote a book, Virtue Hoarders, the case against the professional managerial class. And I think the point's about kind of trying to close down debate and essentially sort of cement their position as the new managers, the technocrats in society, is quite significant. Obviously, it relates to the march through the institutions and so on. Just on a more practical point, I teach undergrads and postgrads in the UK, but also US students studying abroad in the UK. And I'm always a bit wary about what I say, particularly with American students, for fear of causing upset or offense, although that's never happened to date. But it'd be interesting to ask the students here, the speakers and so on, if they have any thoughts about how we can have more allyship, to use that dread term, between academics and tutors and students, because I don't know who the free thinking students are and who's not saying or writing what they might choose to write. I mean, I teach entrepreneurship and innovation and so on, so the areas that I'm teaching are not so controversial, shall we say. But I'd love to think that there would be, if there's an appropriate form of allyship, what that might be.
Thanks, Nico. I'll quickly turn to Julia, and then we'll get final remarks from the panelists. I'm really sorry to all those hands up that I didn't get to. So yeah, Julia, quickly.
Yeah, I actually have the two questions. One for Emma. What was the reaction from your peers to your articles, or to your article? And number two, this is more for the whole group. How do you see things evolving in the future? So I've met pessimists and I've met optimists. How do you see things evolving? Thank you.
So I guess quickly to the first question. Obviously, the response online was very volatile. There was a lot of response online from other UVA students. But when it came to in person, it was generally very supportive. I think part of that to do with the fact that the article was published on the Monday of a week-long spring break. So I think all of the people who would have been the angriest were able to get their angry feelings out far away from me. And then really, I choose my company well. So when it came to the people I was actually spending my time with, who were friends, it was generally supportive, right? Even if people disagreed with me, they felt defensive of me because I was their friend, right? And thought the kind of outsized and very personal reaction I was getting online was kind of nuts. So I think I'm very lucky in that I think when it came to my friends and my social circles, I felt very supportive.
Yeah, just to talk about allyship, I would say if you're not aware of it, Nico, then I would say Academics for Academic Freedom. That's a UK organisation where you'll certainly find oodles of allyship, I'm sure. I mean, as a student perspective, obviously Free Speech Champions has been fantastic in finding allyship. I see what you mean. It's tricky because a lot of my tutors, like you, wouldn't know that that I'm such an advocate for freedom of speech on campus. They just wouldn't know, and often I find myself, as I've said, towing the line somewhat in the work that I submit. But yeah, I'd say Academics for Academic Freedom is a good place to start. In terms of my optimism, which is definitely what I am, I'm optimistic. I think in my time at university, I've witnessed a real coming together, the result of which we see this evening in part, which was unthinkable a few years ago. And so, yeah, I think that the tide is beginning to turn. People are becoming less complacent, and yeah, onwards and upwards. Thank you very much for joining.
great optimistic note to finish on, but we'll just get the last remarks from Stephen and Niloo, and then we'll close up. So Stephen?
Yeah, again, thank you all for hosting this. And it's been a great time. So to get to the question of allyship, I would say, and of course, unfortunately, I don't know, your situation on your campus, but get involved with student organizations that sort of support this message. I know that, professors that are involved with, MNI's debating society, there are some who, we really disagree with, but they sort of have this implicit understanding of what we do and that it is open. And so there is a community there. And I also think it comes from sort of informal, networks at universities as well. Students start talking, and when they know that, one professor is really good at, just as listening to what you have to say, or really supportive in that sphere, that'll lead other students to you. I've found professors who, I really look up to now through those sort of informal networks. And so I would, I guess, encourage you to encourage students to tell their friends if they have other people who feel the same way, to sort of get in contact with you and help them. I would like to say I'm optimistic from where we go here. At the macro level, I feel relatively pessimistic, but on the micro level, I found that, at UVA, especially, I'm surrounded by a great group of people. And I think that, we're going to go on, hopefully, to do great things. And I think we can make, genuine change in our society for the better.
That's awesome. Thank you, Stephen. Niloo, final closing remarks?
Yeah, I think that we should all be hopeful, because the counterculture isn't going away, and the counterculture shifts every, whenever. It will swing back and forth. And I think right now the counterculture is going to be pro-free speech. And so I'm very hopeful in that sense. As for allyship, I don't like that word. I don't like referring to people as my allies. Like, I'm not a country and this isn't a war. I much prefer the term peers, like-minded peers, I suppose. Or even peers who aren't like-minded. Those are also fabulous. I love having a good debate. But yeah, I would say that's kind of what I think. I'm like, the counterculture is coming, especially in comedy. I mean, comedy was so censored, and I think that now we're getting to a point where the young comedians have had enough. And so I'm really excited to see what comes of, the arts as censorship is kind of challenged again.
That's awesome. Thank you, Niloo. So thanks to our panel and to all of you for coming, for all of the interesting and insightful debate that we've had. If you're new to the Free Speech Champions, do go to our website to check out what we do. On our website, you'll be able to subscribe to our mailing list to hear about news and future events. You can check out our magazine, The New Taboo. And if you can make it to London for the end of June, do apply for the Living Freedom Summer School. And yeah, thank you for joining us again. Have a good night, everyone.